After Bilbo suddenly disappears while giving a speech at his birthday party, Gandalf has an odd experience with him, one that concerns him greatly. As Bilbo is preparing to leave, he suddenly finds himself regretting his decision to leave Frodo his ring. He considers keeping it for himself, and when Gandalf insists upon leaving it behind, Bilbo slowly reaches for his blade, while accusing Gandalf of wanting to keep the ring for himself. At this, Gandalf issues a stern warning, and appears tall and menacing. In fear, Bilbo quickly returns to his senses, and Gandalf says to him,
"I'm not trying to rob you, but to help you. I wish you'd trust me as you used."
Bilbo departs without the ring, and feels as though an immense burden has been lifted. But the experience has shaken Gandalf. How could a ring have such a powerful grip over its wearer? Gandalf leaves abruptly from the Shire, telling Frodo to keep the ring safe and hidden, while he spends some time investigating it. As years pass since Gandalf's sudden departure, news begins to spread of wars in the east of Middle-earth. Refugees are passing through the Shire in large numbers, driven from their homes by a newly arisen enemy. Troubled times lay ahead. While Gandalf is away, he travels to Minas Tirith to search their historical archives. He also captures Gollum, and is able to eventually discover the truth about Bilbo's ring. When Gandalf finally returns, he has grave news for Frodo. The ring, Bilbo's ring, which he found in Gollum's cave, is in fact the very same ring created by the Dark Lord Sauron thousands of years ago, as he sought to dominate Middle-earth and become lord over all. Sauron was defeated, as Gandalf recounts.
"The strength of the elves to resist him was greater long ago, and not all men were estranged from them. The men of Westerness came to their aid. That is a chapter of ancient history which it might be good to recall, for there was sorrow then too, and gathering dark, but great valor and great deeds that were not wholly vain."
And now, through a series of rather odd and unexpected events, this ring, this source of immense evil, has come at last to Frodo. Gandalf fears that with the growing might of Sauron, the worst may come to pass.
"Ever since Bilbo left, I have been deeply concerned about you and about all these charming, absurd, helpless hobbits. It would be a grievous blow to the world if the Dark Power overcame the Shire, if all your kind became enslaved."
But who exactly is Gandalf, and why is he so concerned for the fate of Middle-earth, and especially for hobbits? And also, why am I talking about this? Well, as I've said before, fiction often contains allegorical wisdom and insights into the structure of the psyche by depicting archetypes. Fiction, and especially fantasy, is symbolic, and thereby represents certain features of the mind that we all ought to pay attention to. And what Gandalf represents in The Lord of the Rings is, I believe, well worth considerable examination. To understand who Gandalf is, we need to understand the Ainur. In the world of The Lord of the Rings, the Ainur were beings who were there before the creation of the world. These angelic, godlike beings were created to fulfill the plans set by Eru-Ilúvatar, and set his designs into motion. Eru-Ilúvatar is God, and the Ainur are creations of his mind. But one of the Ainur, named Melkor, decided not to follow the plans for the world set by Eru, but instead to impose his own will. As such, as the world is being shaped, Melkor distorts and twists it in various ways, against the original design laid out by Eru-Ilúvatar. Most of the Ainur have been working to reverse the evil spread by Melkor, and to quell the discord caused by his desire to dominate the world. The Ainur are divided into the Valar, who are essentially gods who rule over Middle-earth, and the Maiar, lesser spirits who are nonetheless very powerful, and who serve the Valar. The Valar and the Maiar live across the sea from Middle-earth, in the land of Valinor, and it is from here that Gandalf came, many hundreds of years before the events of the book. He is among the Maiar, the lesser spirits, and he is sent by the Valar to help guide the people of Middle-earth, and to help restore the damage done by Melkor's evil ambitions. Gandalf is an emissary from a higher power, who wishes to hold these forces of darkness at bay, and prevent the great suffering which would unfold should Sauron, who himself is an evil Maiar, come to rule the world. It is Gandalf's duty to guide the people of Middle-earth towards a more noble path, and to give them courage in order to face a perilous foe. And this is why he sets Frodo on his quest to take the ring to Rivendell. So far, we have been speaking about the events of a fictional book, and the question now should be asked: what symbolic function does Gandalf serve? Gandalf represents a higher, spiritual authority. He is directly inspired by the Norse god Odin, and both are representations of the wise old man archetype, and this archetype is much deeper and more significant than it first appears. According to Carl Jung, it is directly related to the notion of spirit, which he defines as that which opposes the material world, i.e., that which is metaphysical. This may sound like we are speaking about things which don't exist, but the word metaphysical is not synonymous with non-existent. That which is spiritual is imaginary, and as it turns out, imaginary ideas are very important for human society. One could say that civilization is itself a product of an imaginary metaphysical system. Take for instance moral values. Do moral values actually exist? They aren't physical, and yet they clearly shape societies in important ways. Moral values are imaginary, they exist solely in our heads, and yet by acting as though they were true, society is significantly transformed, and humans live in a manner far removed from nature. They constitute, as it were, the spirit of mankind, the part of us which transcends the material world. This even includes things like the calendar, or the boundaries between countries, since these two have a kind of metaphysical existence in the imagination. The notion of the metaphysical is what separates humans from animals. We live in an imagined order, and strive to transcend our genetic foundations. During the origins of human civilization, the notion of metaphysical gods also establish and solidify a kind of metaphysical order. We believed for much of history that beings from a higher spiritual plane have established rules and values by which humans are to live. For example, the Anunnaki were believed by the ancient Sumerians to have come from a heavenly place and gifted mankind with the skills of agriculture, architecture, and language. The Kingdom of Heaven, which in The Lord of the Rings is represented by the land of Valinor to the west of Middle-earth, is meant to be a model which we emulate, through which we can produce heaven on earth, at least ideally. By emulating the gods, we live in accordance with the more noble path they have laid before us, assuming of course that it is a noble path. In fact, such spiritual beings, who we could also consider to be imaginary entities, have played an important role in shaping humans into the moral and spiritual beings that we are today. We aren't merely creatures bound to instinct, but have found ways to live in a more virtuous manner, through which the astonishing products of civilization come to exist. Each and every person is in possession of such an archetypal notion. It first starts as the animus, the inherent masculine concept, which first becomes a father complex, and which begins to be the purveyor of higher principles to the psyche. As Jung writes, "It struck me that a certain kind of father complex has a spiritual character, so to speak, in the sense that the father image gives rise to statements, actions, tendencies, impulses, etc. In men, a positive father complex very often produces a certain credulity with regard to authority, and a distinct willingness to bow down before all spiritual dogmas and values. This even includes the ego, since this too has a kind of metaphysical nature. We each have values and morals, which we would ideally uphold, assuming that we don't falter, but these are imaginary, or rather metaphysical. Their existence is contingent upon a belief in them. Nevertheless, we all attempt to live up to our morals and values, to our ideal metaphysical selves, so to speak. Your moral values constitute your spirit, and this side of your existence is apart from the material constitution of your body, since it exists within the imagination. You might be wondering how this is related to old men, and the answer is that wise old men have traditionally been the purveyor and even upholders of the notion of spirit. In past cultures, the elders were the holders of knowledge, and it was their responsibility to make sure that all abided by the laws and morals set forth by the gods, or God. Many gods actually appear as old men for this reason, such as Odin and Zeus. It is therefore through wise old men that the notion of spirit is upheld, particularly in the family situation, where it is traditionally the father's responsibility to make sure that his children uphold the metaphysical values, such as being kind to one another, telling the truth, and obeying the rules of society. Although we must always keep in mind that different cultures naturally have different moral beliefs, and so different notions of what constitutes the spirit. Jung writes, "In dreams, it is always the father figure from whom the decisive convictions, prohibitions, and wise counsels emanate. The invisibility of this source is frequently emphasized by the fact that it consists simply of an authoritative voice which passes final judgments." Gandalf too possesses a kind of authority in Middle-earth, which emanates from a higher power. At the Council of Elrond, it is clear that the finding of the One Ring has once again stirred troubles upon Middle-earth, and Gandalf, as a guide to the free peoples of Middle-earth, offers counsel on what should be done in the coming war. It is Gandalf who orders Frodo to show the Council the One Ring, so that they may understand the grave nature of the threat now faced before them. It is at the Council that Gandalf discusses why he had been delayed and unable to join Frodo at Bree as originally planned. Having arrived at Isengard, seeking the leader of his order, Gandalf discovers that Saruman, who was sent to Middle-earth by the Valar for the same purpose as Gandalf, has strayed from his original purpose, and now seeks the One Ring for himself.
The elder days are gone, the middle days are passing, the younger days are beginning. The time of the elves is over, but our time is at hand, the world of men which we must rule. But we must have power, power to order all things as we will, for that good which only the wise can see.
Saruman represents a fundamental truth about the archetype of spirit, in that a metaphysical authority may not necessarily impose morals which are inherently righteous or virtuous, but may in fact be evil and domineering. Jung notes that this archetype sometimes appears as an evil figure, more like a tyrant than a wise man, and who wishes to impose his desires upon others. This can be understood as the negative aspect of this archetype. Just as all archetypes have a positive, favorable, bright side that points upwards, so also they have one that points downwards, partly negative and unfavorable, partly chthonic, but for the rest merely neutral. This difference is clear from the contrast between Gandalf and Saruman. While Gandalf wishes to preserve the freedom enjoyed by the people of Middle-earth, Saruman wishes to crush it, and rule over men, and wield enormous power in order to shape Middle-earth according to his own vision. Gandalf does not wish to impose his own order, but rather to support the vision of the Valar. It is important to note Tolkien's Catholic worldview, where we find this principle expressed as the will of God, who is the highest good, and who wishes to produce heaven on earth. In fact, Jesus can be thought of in an archetypally similar way, that of a spiritual being sent from a higher authority to bring forth righteousness and set the world in order. However, we may be led astray, not always by nature, but by other metaphysical principles. This is what Saruman represents, the spirit in a dark form, more of a tyrant rather than an aid to a more spiritual existence, such as we have attained, who wishes to assert his own power rather than serve a higher one. This is why in the real world, though our moral values may be derived from metaphysical entities such as gods, there is no certainty that these moral virtues will produce a necessarily good world. After all, many evils have been committed, while supposedly upholding heavenly virtues. Gandalf represents the archetype of the good spirit, of the ideal spirit, who truly does try to produce a virtuous world. He is a symbol for this principle, hypothetical may it be. This symbol points to what we could be. It is an ideal which we are to strive for, and a goal in which we should believe. Such a concept as the ideal world should always be kept in mind, and we should always struggle to bring forth such a world of order and justice. Gandalf and Elrond make it clear that there is only one choice, to take the ring to the place where it was created, so that it may be destroyed. Frodo at last decides to take on the burden of carrying the One Ring, seeing that he has been ultimately tied to its fate. But he will not go alone, for Gandalf will go with him as his guide, and others as well will volunteer for the quest. The Fellowship departs and comes to the Pass of Caradhras, where ill weather leaves the company demoralized. Despite their efforts, it becomes clear that this route is unpassable, and Gandalf and Aragorn discuss what other options are available. They consider the mines of Moria, but know that a shadow lingers over it. They decide at last to venture into the mountain. Before the doors of Durin, from a pool of water, a many-tentacled creature attempts to snatch Frodo, forcing the Fellowship into the mines as the door shuts behind them. As they descend further into the depths, the company is attacked by orcs. Gandalf attempts to seal the door, but as they flee, something pursues them. At last, the Fellowship sees what had been hunting them in the darkness.
It was like a great shadow, in the middle of which was a dark form, of man shape maybe, yet greater, and a power and terror seemed to be in it and to go before it. Its streaming mane kindled and blazed behind it. In its right hand was a blade like a stepping tongue of fire. In its left it held a whip of many thongs.
The Balrog appears as a demon cloaked in fire. Balrogs too were once Maiar, but were twisted and corrupted by Melkor. Gandalf's encounter with the Balrog within the caverns of Moria also represents an archetypal idea. The notion of spirit means, fundamentally, a restriction of instinctual behavior. We limit our instincts so that we can rise spiritually. But such a rise has painful consequences, since rising to the spiritual heights necessarily entails producing a shadow, and the higher we rise, the blacker our shadow becomes. Spirituality opposes itself to the material world, but at the core of the human psyche is something which is foundational, and not always in line with our moral intentions. This darker side of the psyche is found within its core. Humans are spiritual beings, but we are also natural beings, and there is always the risk that our spiritual side may be subsumed by the ever-present, chaotic side of the psyche. The Balrog represents Gandalf's shadow, since he too is a Maiar, but has been transformed into a chaotic demon. Gandalf stands against the Balrog at the Bridge of Khazad-dûm and declares that he is a servant of a higher power.
I am servant of the secret fire, wielder of the flame of Arnor. You cannot pass. The dark fire will not avail you, flame of Udun. Go back to the shadow. You cannot pass.
The secret fire to which Gandalf refers is the will of Ilúvatar, the true ruler of Middle-earth, and it is Gandalf's duty to uphold the secret fire. But once Gandalf destroys the bridge and the Balrog is cast into the depths, its whip suddenly curls around Gandalf's legs and drags him down into the abyss. Thus begins Gandalf's battle with the demon, with a shadow who was equal in stature to himself. Gandalf and his foe land in a subterranean lake, infested with all manner of primordial beings, who had been there since the foundations of the world were laid. Just as within the human psyche are ancient and strange forces that know nothing of our higher spirituality.
Far, far below the deepest delvings of the dwarves, the world is gnawed by nameless things. Even Sauron knows them not. They are older than he.
The spirit is in a constant battle between the chaotic forces working within the psyche, and is very frequently overcome by such forces. The spirit is often plunged into the darkness, where it must struggle in order to re-emerge. Gandalf pursues the Balrog up the endless stair, where he at last slays his foe, but then darkness takes him, and he strays out of thought and time, dying there at the top of the peak. But his task was not over, and so he's brought back to life and reborn as Gandalf the White. The spirit may indeed succumb to darkness and chaos, but it may also be born anew. Humanity has faced many ages, where it seemed as though chaos would tear apart the world we had created. But the spirit within us has been able, during many dark epochs, to renew itself and stand its ground amidst the storm. Gandalf rejoins Aragorn, Legolas, and Gimli in Fanghorn Forest, and as they set out for Rohan, Gandalf whistles for his steed Shadowfax, a proud and mighty horse who only Gandalf could tame. They go to see Theoden, the king of Rohan, who has been corrupted by Saruman and unable to lead his people and protect Rohan, which has come under attack. Gandalf cures Theoden of Sauron's poisonous influence and reminds him of his responsibilities. Gandalf counsels him to trust Éomer, his nephew, once more, and to take action against those who are ravaging Rohan. The king is rejuvenated, and he acts decisively to set out in force and protect his realm. Gandalf, in his archetypal role, stands for the spirit, which must abide by its responsibilities, rather than retreat in cowardice. It is the king's responsibility to keep his people safe, and Gandalf is there to remind Theoden of this, of the spiritual oaths he has taken, and the duty he must now fulfill. At the Battle of the Hornburg, the Rohirrim are able to destroy Saruman's army with the help of Gandalf and the Fellowship. However, Sauron remains strong, and when Pippin accidentally looks into the Palantir, it is not long before Pippin and Gandalf are riding towards Minas Tirith, the capital of the Kingdom of Gondor, to bring news of Sauron's coming offensive against them. As he rides through Gondor, he warns the soldiers he encounters of the coming danger.
Courage will now be your best defence against the storm that is at hand. That and such hope as I bring. For not all the tidings that I bring are evil, but leave your trowels and sharpen your swords.
The steward of Gondor, Denethor, is in despair at the loss of his son Boromir, and is more concerned with his rule of Gondor than with the defense of the city, and in anger Gandalf tells him,
The rule of no realm is mine, neither of Gondor nor any other, great or small. But all worthy things that are in peril as the world now stands, those are my care. And for my part, I shall not wholly fail of my task, though Gondor should perish, if anything passes through this night that can still grow fair or bear fruit and flower again in days to come. For I also am a steward, did you not know?
The forces of Sauron begin to gain ground, routing Faramir's troops as they attempt to keep the enemy on the other side of the Anduin. The courage of the defenders of Minas Tirith wanes, as thousands of men, orcs, and trolls begin to besiege the city. Their morale becomes further depleted when the enemy cruelly launches the severed heads of their captives into the city, and the Nazgûl swarm overhead, and the terrible, shivering shrieks of their fell beasts cause many in the city to weep in despair. Seeing this, Gandalf takes command of the defense of the city, and rouses the defenders once again to stout-heartedness, not to flee, but to stand steadfast. And when the commander of the enemy forces, the Witch King of Angmar, at last breaks through the gate, Gandalf is there to face him. It is precisely in such hours that the spirit must remain steadfast, and not succumb to fear and cowardice. Courage demands a stern spirit that can stand with a steadfast resolve, even as all hope seems to fade. It is the conscious ego which can choose to uphold spiritual principles, and though it is often difficult, It is what allows us to stand bravely in the face of adversity. The valor of the spirit may be tested, and may even be destroyed, but it is the spirit within each man and woman that can valiantly face chaos and act to prevent it from destroying all that we hold dear. Tolkien was a veteran of the Second World War, and one can imagine the terror faced by the Allied soldiers as they faced a brutal foe, and yet they courageously fought so that all they held dear could be preserved. The spirit in man is capable of waylaying such evil should it arise, and it is what acts within us to have courage, when it is simply easier to flee in terror and succumb to the darkness. Denethor, believing that his son is near death and that all hope is lost, orders a great pyre built so that he may burn himself in Faramir, as he believes that the West cannot hope to stand against Sauron. Hearing of this, Gandalf and Pippin ride to the citadel to save Faramir.
"He will not wake again," said Denethor. "Battle is vain. Why should we wish to live longer? Why should we not go to death side by side? Authority is not given to you, steward of Gondor, to order the hour of your death," answered Gandalf. "And only the heathen kings under the domination of the Dark Power did thus, slaying themselves in pride and despair, murdering their kin to ease their own death."
When the battle is over and the siege lifted, Gandalf summons the Lords of the West to council. It has been discovered that Sauron still has significant strength, and thousands of orcs await in Mordor, ready to crush them. Gandalf knows it is important to defeat Sauron, and clear the world from his evil influence.
"Other evils there are that may come, for Sauron is himself but a servant or emissary. Yet it is not our part to muster all the tides of the world, but to do what is in us for the succour of those years wherein we are set, uprooting the evil in the fields that we know, so that those who live after may have clean earth to till. What weather they shall have is not ours to rule."
Gandalf gives wise counsel to the Lords, so that they may choose their course correctly. He reasons that Sauron believes that Aragorn must have the ring, so that he can wield its power, but he knows now not to attack, and instead hide behind the Black Gate, biding his time until the ring's corrupting influence overtakes Aragorn. Thus, this leaves innumerable orcs in Frodo's path, and so Gandalf advises them to attack the Black Gates and draw out Sauron's forces.
"His eye is now straining towards us, blind almost to all else that is moving. So we must keep it. Therein lies all our hope. This, then, is my counsel. We have not the ring. In wisdom or great folly it has been sent away to be destroyed, lest it destroy us. Without it, we cannot by force defeat his force. But we must at all costs keep his eye from his true peril. We cannot achieve victory by arms, but by arms we can give the ring-bearer his only chance, frail though it may be."
It is almost certain that their small force will be crushed by Sauron's, but this sacrifice may be enough to allow the ring-bearer to complete his task.
"We must walk open-eyed into that trap with courage, but small hope for ourselves. For, my lords, it may well prove that we ourselves shall perish utterly in a black battle far from the living lands, so that even if Barad-dûr be thrown down, we shall not live to see a new age. But this, I deem, is our duty. And better so than to perish none the less, as we surely shall, if we sit here, and know as we die that no new age shall be."
It is such wisdom that the archetype of the spirit is able to produce. All higher knowledge which mankind has produced belongs to the spirit, and its preservation and transfer to succeeding generations has allowed humans to reach a refined degree of spirituality. When we consciously think, we are able to wisely plan and decide, and make the world explicit. This itself is a kind of spiritualization of the world, generating a map of it in consciousness, which is why the masculine side of the psyche gives rise to conscious reasoning and planning. The wise old man is a symbol for this idea, that of wisdom, which too has metaphysical foundations, for it is a product of the mind, and belongs to the higher creations of mankind. The old man thus represents knowledge, reflection, insight, wisdom, cleverness, and intuition on the one hand, and on the other, moral qualities such as goodwill and readiness to help, which make his spiritual character sufficiently plain. 6,000 infantry and 1,000 cavalry set forth from Minas Tirith, with several thousand left behind to guard the city and the northern flank. The Nazgûl stalk them from above, out of sight from all but Legolas. Once they reach the Black Gate, the Lords of the West and the rest of the Fellowship demand that Sauron come forth. Sauron instead sends forth his emissary, who is named the Mouth of Sauron. It is in this moment that Gandalf uses his wisdom to see what information can be gathered, while also concealing his own plans, as though engaged in a perilous battle of wits. Though the mouth of Sauron has Frodo's mithril coat to the horror of the Fellowship, Gandalf is cleverly able to surmise that there is a chance that Frodo still lives, and that Sauron has yet to uncover the plot. After the mouth of Sauron states his terms, including that Sauron be proclaimed sole ruler of all the land east of the Anduin, and that Isengard be rebuilt, Gandalf tells him,
"This is much to demand for the delivery of one servant, that your master should receive in exchange what he must else fight many a war to gain. And if indeed we rated this prisoner so high, what surety have we that Sauron, the base master of treachery, will keep his part? Where is this prisoner? Let him be brought forth and yielded to us, and then we will consider these demands."
It seemed then to Gandalf, intent, watching him as a man engaged in fencing with a deadly foe, that for the taking of a breath the messenger was at a loss.
Thus revealing that hope still yet lives, that Frodo may still complete his quest. Sauron springs his trap, and the army begins its valiant effort to hold out until the ring is destroyed. They are nearly defeated, but victory is at last attained when the ring is destroyed. Order is restored to the world, and the great enemy is defeated. Though evil is never fully vanquished, Gandalf's task is at last complete, and he readies himself to depart from Middle-earth. Gandalf tells the King of Gondor, Aragorn, who has been crowned King Elisar, his new duties, to preserve the kingdom of Gondor, and see that the Age of Men is glorious and filled with splendor. At last, Gandalf, along with Frodo, Bilbo, Galadriel, and Elrond, departs to the west, to Valinor, to the land of the Ainur, ruled by the Valar, where the leaves never fall, so that the people of Middle-earth may enjoy their hard-won freedom at last. Gandalf represents the ideal higher order, one which genuinely produces a better world, such as a world where we make peace a principle, where justice prevails, and where those who have faltered are given the chance for redemption. He is, as we have mentioned before, a close parallel to Jesus, who also came to Earth to uphold higher principles. It is clear that the real world is more complex. We all have different values, which we would ideally impose upon the world, and the spirit is not insusceptible to corruption. Oftentimes, the imposition of metaphysical ideals amounts to tyranny. This is why we must always hold the notion of the ideal spirit as a goal to which we should strive. We should strive for an imaginary world which is harmonious, in which all people benefit. Humans have been in pursuit of such an ideal, and we have very often created a better world through the spirit. During the Second World War, humanity's spirit was near crumbling, as the evil within humankind was unleashed. But seeing this darkness, we decided to strive for a world where peace could prevail, and each human life was respected, and the world we produced was, in many ways, better than the one before. It won't always be perfect, but the freedom and peace many of us enjoy was won with real sacrifice and immense effort. True, the archetype of the spirit is capable of working for good as well as for evil, but it depends upon man's free, i.e. conscious decision, whether the good will be perverted into something satanic. The spirit, however, is not always of a collective nature. The spiritual principles we develop at the individual level challenge us to be the best version of ourselves. They allow us to make commitments to ourselves, such as to be more social, to exercise more, to be more heroic, and to be more stoic. It is important to never underestimate the power of one's spiritual drives, and those with strong spirits can endure many trials. Each of us has the archetype of the spirit within us. Each of us can rise to the spiritual goals we set for ourselves, and though we may falter and be led astray, noble is he who makes the attempt to produce the best version of themselves, and to strive ever upwards into the spiritual heights. In my opinion, we live in an age of a faltering spirit. Unaware of the metaphysical foundations of civilization, most people have weak spirits, and would rather regress rather than uphold their principles. This poses a significant threat to society, especially in the midst of turmoil. Gandalf represents what we could attempt to reach, either individually or collectively. He represents the spirit, which can and must rise to meet the challenge of the world, no matter how chaotic it can often become, no matter how much despair and misery we may endure. A strong spirit can cut through it all, and preserve the heavenly virtues which we have thus far developed. Though the spirit may evolve and change, as spiritual values shift and realign, we must always strive for the principle of a truly good world that can be brought about through the pursuit of heavenly ideals. This is what heaven represents, the best possible world, and though it isn't real, we must always keep it in mind as something worth fighting for.